All right, so let's talk about China, Confucius, and Karl Marx. Um, Three rather large topics, so I won't talk for days and days. I'll try to reduce it down and make it simple as I see it. Now, China, of course, is a huge nation, 1.5 billion people, and a very large industrial economy. It's also a very old nation. It's been around for many thousands of years. And what's interesting is that its present political system, um, essentially run by the Chinese Communist Party, is relatively new. It's under a century old, I think it's fair to say, and the main system was declared just after the Second World War in about 1949, and it's been a one-party state since then. So for about 70 years. So a blip, really, in Chinese history when all is said and done. And of course, being a communist party, although they're liberalising economically now, the reality is that you're talking about a state that has, in the past, the recent past, been heavily predicated on the works of Karl Marx. Although he only wrote one of his books, and then the others done after his death are agglomerations of work, I suppose. Anyway, I suppose what we need to consider is that Karl Marx was a German political economist who reacted in many ways to Britain or London in the 1840s, where he lived, smoking cigars, doing some of his writings. And Confucius was a Chinese philosopher, probably the greatest Chinese philosopher and one of the greatest philosophers in human history, who died in 478 BC, so about 2,500 years ago, was Confucius's time. And I suppose what I'm interested in is a nation like China with 1.5 billion people. What should they be doing? Should they be following Confucius or Karl Marx? And I think it's fair to say that China has profited in some ways from having a one-party state, but there's been massive trade-offs as well. And I think it's highly questionable as to whether they should be following, to any high degree, any philosophy coming from a German philosopher living in London in the mid-19th century, the other side of the world. The reality is that Confucius stressed the need for personal and governmental morality, and the need for individuals to act with absolute discretion, sincerity, kindness, and with a strong public purpose. And I think it's fair to say that Confucius's approach was the right and is the right approach for China, a country with many, not just hundreds of millions of people, but billions of people, where personal behaviour, the individual behaviour of Chinese individuals is so important, because that leads to the many trillions of interactions, financial and personal, every day. And the only way to really encourage a strong society in China is to have a strong emphasis on true Confucianism and his approach to how people and the government obviously it's tempting for a government to say, well, that's all very well, but we've got 1.5 billion people here. We need to keep control. We don't want riots. We don't want people saying whatever they want. We want to have as much harmony as possible. So then the question becomes, well, yes, what do you trade off for an enforced harmony? And I think it's fair to say that you trade away too much by adopting the philosophy of someone who was very much affected by mid-19th century Great Britain, which is what Karl Marx was, rather than following the philosophy and work of Confucius, who had a much better concept of China, its people, and its history, and where China needed to go, which is who Confucius was. So China is going to has had an interesting history. It will continue to have an interesting history, but I do think that apart from its economic liberalization, its successful future lies in their strong embrace of their great philosopher, Confucius, and his works.